The library closed on March 16th. We had had a wonderful February where we gave a golf tournament, a mini golf tournament that took place in the library, and we were on a real high about how wonderful things were going in the library. And then all of a sudden, on March 16th, based on the instructions of the governor and the Board of Library Commissioners, the library had to close down. All of the town offices and the schools also closed down at about that time. We couldn't very well work remotely because most of the work that we do involves dealing with physical objects, most of which we couldn't take home with us. So what we did was a few of us would come into the library from time to time so that we could check the mail, so that we could process materials that had come in, that had been ordered prior to the closure. We had to make sure that everything was still being cleaned. There were a number of tasks that we did during that time. After a while, it was just myself coming into the library, and I took on a new project which we'd never had time to do before, and that was database cleanup. Turned out that many of our call numbers were not correct, which made running a report to do inventory impossible. So I went through the database for the nonfiction materials and corrected all of those call numbers so that we could then do inventory, another task that we were able to do while we were closed. We also took the time during closure to purchase materials that we knew we would need when we reopened. Things like hand sanitizer, face masks, plexiglass screens, disinfectant, lots of things like that that we knew we would need at the time that we were able to reopen. We kept busy, but we weren't here the whole time. We reopened in July of 2020, but that was only after we heard through Governor Baker's various phases and stages of COVID closedness and openness that it would be okay for the library to do so. We also consulted with the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners and the North Brookfield Board of Health to ensure that the town didn't have so many COVID cases that it would be inappropriate to open. Once we got the okay from those different organizations, we were able to reopen for 15 hours a week. We opened for 3 hours each day for 5 days, and we alternated morning and evening hours so that patrons who were still working or who had other conflicts would be able to find a time when they could come to the library. We continued doing the curbside service that we started doing when we were closed. Some patrons continued to use that service, feeling that it wasn't safe enough yet to come inside a building. But many patrons did come back and take advantage of being on site in the library. We heard from people from all over the region that they were so happy to come to North Brookfield because we were open and their own libraries were not. It was nice to be able to provide that service, and we felt that we were doing it very safely. After consulting with the Board of Health, we put several restrictions and protocols into place. The first one was that anyone who came into the library had to wear a mask. When they entered, they had to use hand sanitizer. They were expected to use social distancing, keep 6 feet apart from anyone else. We even put markers on the floor to indicate where that 6-foot distance was. We had arrows that we put on the floor between the stack shelving so that people could all flow in the same direction and not get in each other's way. We had hand sanitizer that we scattered throughout the building, every place where people would be handling materials. We also said that only 10 people could use the library at a time, and that they should only stay in the library for about a half hour. Even the elevator was only supposed to be used by one person or one family at a time. All the toys in the children's library were put away so that they would not be encouraged to stay and play. And we also wouldn't have to disinfect all of those toys every time. We also had a protocol whereby the custodian would clean every surface that anybody could possibly have touched every day. We also had a volunteer who came in twice a week who did additional cleaning and disinfecting. We made 2 computers available to the public, one on the lower level and one here on the main level. We put plastic over the keyboards so that people wouldn't be touching the keys. And every time someone used the computer, we would replace the plastic. Eventually, we shifted to an ultraviolet light disinfectant, and that was a little bit easier. But again, every time someone used the computer, we had to run out there with our little disinfecting wand and clean the keyboards. We did all of those things, and I think we were so busy doing all of those COVID protocols that it was a good thing we were only open 15 hours a week, because that all took quite a lot of time. But people were very appreciative of being able to come to the library. Oh, I forgot one other thing. We also quarantined any materials that were returned to the book drop or that were handled in the library but weren't borrowed, or some of the things that came back through delivery once delivery service did resume within CW Mars. So we were busy with lots of COVID protocols, but it worked very well. We had one case of COVID on the staff fairly early on. It was when we were mostly closed anyway, so it didn't have a big impact on library operations. We did have a couple of occasions where one of our staff members was exposed to someone who had COVID, which resulted in testing and quarantining. And at the beginning of the pandemic, testing was kind of a difficult thing. You had to make an appointment to go someplace and be tested, and then you had to wait a couple of days before you got your results. And so while that person was quarantining and waiting to be tested, and sometimes quarantining after if there was some indication that there might be positivity, we were down that person. So we did have to make some adjustments. And again, I was grateful that we weren't open full time, because it made covering for those hours much easier. We also had a retirement during COVID. In 2020, our beloved children's librarian, Rosemary McKenzie, decided that there was really very little for her to do. People were not coming into the library. Children's services were completely limited. There was no programming. She decided at that time to retire. So we couldn't have a big reception for her like we might have wanted to and would have done had there been no COVID restrictions. But we did something better. We had a big event where Rosemary was honored by a ceremony outside the front of the library where many speakers paid tribute, and there was a drive-by parade where people were able to get in their cars, which were beautifully decorated, and drive down Main Street honking their horns and wishing Miss Rosemary well. It was a fantastic event. And I think it was so much better than what we would have been able to do had we had it inside the library. So that was actually a good way that the COVID pandemic helped us to gather together safely outdoors, socially distancing, and to show our appreciation for more than 30 years of service by Rosemary McKenzie. So that was a staff change. When she retired, Brianna Lamb, who was our assistant librarian, was able to take over as children's librarian, and she provided lots of great services herself during the rest of the pandemic, providing take and make crafts and things like that. So staffing was affected, not seriously, but there were changes that came about as a result and during the pandemic. There aren't too many changes that we would make, but one thing that I did notice and have since been promoting is that people are making greater use of e-materials, e-books, e-audio, and they have been borrowing those at greater and greater rates since the pandemic too. So we are promoting those, training people how to use Overdrive and Libby, the app that they have been putting on their cell phones. So that's been a big change, or a big increase, I think, in usage as a result of the pandemic. We also have made a great use of Zoom technology. We couldn't meet face-to-face. Our programming was shut down for most of the pandemic, and so Zoom became our way of getting together with people. In fact, the library book group, which usually meets once a month, was meeting weekly on Zoom so that we could get together and talk about books that we were reading. It was fantastic. And ever since we started doing that, and this right today, it's 2023, ever since then we've been doing hybrid book group meetings, because we had some former members of the book group who live on Cape Cod and they still want to participate. And now we also have a member in New Hampshire. So we have hybrid Zoom meetings for our book group, which have been a wonderful success. And we will continue to do that as long as people want to visit with the rest of the group and contribute to discussions from a distance. We've also used Zoom for trustees meetings, for friends meetings, and other events where we want people who cannot make it to the library participate. So using that kind of technology for programming and for meetings has been a wonderful addition to what we can provide our users, and we will continue with that. I think the town of North Brookfield has done a good job. They took advantage of the various grants that the federal government made available, the CARES Act money as well as ARPA money, and they distributed that money to the different town departments as appropriate. They had committees set up that assisted the town in determining which requests made sense. For example, the library was able to get masks and sanitizer through the CARES Act money. We also were able to get an air filtration system for the first floor where we do the most, where there's the most activity. And so we were able to take advantage of that thanks to the work that the town did in getting that grant funding. I would also like to praise the Board of Health. I think the Board of Health did an amazing job reaching out to the citizens of North Brookfield. They helped us acquire a lot of the equipment and supplies that we used here in the library, as well as giving us lots of good advice. But we heard a lot from library patrons about how the Board of Health made phone calls and made appointments and were able to get people to vaccinations and do all the things that the COVID pandemic made necessary. And I didn't hear a single negative thing about the Board of Health, and from working with them myself, I can say that they did an outstanding job. Well, a couple of the things that I've already mentioned are good things that came out of the pandemic. They included the increased use of Zoom technology to get people together even when they're not physically together, and also the work that we did doing our database cleanup and our inventory. We would never have been able to do the inventory of the entire collection had we not been able to find the time to do the database work and the inventory themselves. So those were two really good things. In terms of life lessons, I think the pandemic reinforced for me how important libraries are in a community and how much people love reading and learning. As I mentioned earlier, people who couldn't get to their own libraries and who came to this one were so grateful that they could be in a library building, surrounded by books and assisted by people who like helping other people. There's something about a library that is warm and welcoming and supportive and encouraging to people that they missed when they couldn't go to their own libraries or come to this one. And so going through the pandemic and seeing how people responded when they were able to come back just showed me how important libraries are and how grateful I am that I've been part of one like the North Brookfield Haston Library.